Tonight, snow has buried the roof of a house near the meeting of the Knife and Missouri rivers in present-day North Dakota. The people inside have no metal stove, no iron chimney, and no glass window through which to inspect the weather. Beyond the entrance passage, the cold is hard enough to stiffen wet hide and turn every exposed breath into a pale cloud. Inside, a small fire burns in the center of the floor beneath an opening in the roof. Around it are sleeping platforms, robes, reed mats, baskets, tools, stored food, and the quiet work of keeping a household alive. The remains of three major Hidatsa settlements, Awatiksha Shia, Awatiksha, and Hidatsa village, still mark this landscape. Once, clusters of circular earth lodges stood close together here, forming communities of farmers, hunters, traders, children, elders, and relatives whose winter lives depended on much more than the flame at the center of a room. At first, the arrangement looks incomplete. An open fire inside a house seems less like a heating system than the beginning of an administrative problem. Smoke must escape, sparks must not catch the roof, fuel must last, children must be kept away from the hottest coals, older people and anyone who is ill must be protected from drafts, food must remain dry, and every time the roof opening allows smoke to leave, it also gives precious warmth a path toward the winter sky. Yet families lived through severe winters here long before sheet metal stoves became ordinary household equipment. The surprising part is that the fire was only one piece of the answer. Before we settle beside it, take a moment to like the video or subscribe if quiet journeys into the past are your kind of company. It helps more curious listeners find their way here. But first, one correction. There was no single Native American winter. The peoples of the forests, deserts, river valleys, mountains, grasslands, subarctic country, and Arctic did not build one kind of home, burn one fuel, wear one form of clothing, or preserve one collection of foods. A winter dwelling along the upper Missouri answered different problems from a caribou skin tent in Alaska or a masonry room in the southwest. Even neighboring nations could organize seasonal movement, hunting, farming, shelter, and household work in different ways. So this journey begins in one specific place, among the Earth Lodge communities associated with the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara peoples of the upper Missouri. From outside, an Earth Lodge could look less like a building than a low hill that had developed a doorway. Heavy timbers supported the structure. Smaller poles, willow branches, grass, and earth covered the frame. The roof rose gently toward a central smoke opening. A protected entrance passage lengthened the route between the exposed winter air and the main room. Snow could settle over the earthen surface until the lodge seemed to sink even farther into the ground. That appearance was not accidental. The earth performed much of the work a later stove would appear to do. A metal stove creates a hot, enclosed surface, concentrates combustion, and can send smoke through a pipe. But heat is useful only when the building does not immediately surrender it. Thick earth slowed the exchange between the air indoors and the bitter air outside. The interior did not have to become uniformly warm by modern standards. It had to prevent every surface, sleeping place, tool, and person from becoming equally cold. The household created a manageable pocket inside winter. The central hearth supplied cooking heat, light, and warmth. The roof opening allowed smoke to rise out, though wind could make that process imperfect. Anyone who has sat beside a campfire knows that smoke can identify the person who has just become comfortable and move directly toward them. Inside a lodge, this was more than an irritation. Fire management required experience and attention. The size of the flame mattered, the dryness of the wood mattered, the wind mattered, the position of bedding, tools, food containers, robes, and people mattered. A roaring blaze produced impressive heat, but it consumed fuel rapidly, threw sparks, and filled the upper room with more smoke. A smaller fire maintained over a sound bed of coals could remain useful for longer. They were not relying on one heroic flame. Warmth was layered. Earth slowed heat loss, the entrance passage weakened the wind, robes and bedding held heat near the body. Sleeping places separated people from the cold ground. Food supplied the energy required to work, shiver, repair, cook, carry, and think. Occupants shifted their positions according to drafts, tasks, and the changing behavior of the hearth. The room was occupied intelligently. Near the center, firelight reached the great roof supports. Beyond them, the lodge edges were dimmer. Sleeping platforms and prepared resting places stood around the interior. Mats and hides reduced contact with cold surfaces. Baskets and containers held food and household materials. Beneath the floor, carefully prepared storage pits could protect part of the winter supply. Survival was present in several forms at once. It was in the soil overhead. It was in corn kept dry beneath the floor. It was in a hide cleaned, softened, cut, and sewn months before anyone needed it at midnight. It was in wood already carried home. And it was in the knowledge of which small problem would become dangerous if ignored. A damaged roof could admit moisture, damp bedding could steal heat, a neglected draft could make one sleeping place unsafe. A shrinking food store could alter every decision. Smoke that failed to clear could force a household to choose between breathable air and useful warmth, a choice with no charming historical answer. The lodge had to be maintained. Timbers had been selected. Earth had been packed. Crops had been grown, harvested, dried, and stored. Hides had been processed. Tools had been repaired. Fuel had been gathered or would have to be obtained despite snow, wind, and limited daylight. Winter was not a sudden contest between a person and the weather. It was the season in which months of decisions finally submitted their results. That is why the missing metal stove can mislead the modern eye. It encourages us to search for one clever object that replaced it. No single object did. The house conserved heat, the hearth released it. Clothing guarded the body, food sustained the work, the household connected all of them. Even then, comfort was not guaranteed. Smoke could sting. Floors remained cool. Illness, hunger, injury, fire, and severe weather were real dangers. Historical skill should never be mistaken for immunity. Still, inside the lodge, the arrangement could hold. Wind crossed the river country and climbed over the rounded roof. Snow settled on the earth above. A fire shortened into coals. Someone adjusted a robe. Someone checked the food. Someone listened to the draft changing at the entrance. And beneath the floor, sealed in darkness, part of the winter's true heat waited in the form of stored food. Stored food could warm a household without producing a single flame. That sounds too obvious to deserve attention. Yet it changes the entire picture. A family with a sound shelter but an empty cache was not secure. A family with plenty of fuel but damaged clothing was not secure. A family with warm robes but no dependable food supply was not secure. Winter survival was a chain, and the chain changed with the landscape. The phrase Native American families can flatten hundreds of distinct nations into one imaginary household. It can place a plains teepee beside an Arctic oil lamp, add a southwestern adobe wall, hang a woodland snowshoe at the entrance, and present the result as though everyone had followed one ancient instruction manual. They did not. North America contained coastal rain, interior drought, broad river valleys, open grasslands, dense forests, high mountains, subarctic cold, and Arctic darkness. Some communities lived in large farming villages, others moved seasonally to follow animals, fish, plants, trade, or weather. Some households relied heavily on stored crops, others depended on hunting, fishing, marine foods, or carefully timed combinations of several resources. The human body posed the same basic problem everywhere. It lost heat, required energy, and performed badly when wet. The answer depended on place. Along the upper Missouri, heavy earth-covered lodges made sense because families lived within settled agricultural communities. They could invest enormous labor in structures that were not expected to fold into bundles and travel. Fields of corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers supported village life. Underground storage allowed part of that harvest to remain close at hand. The house and the food system were built for each other, On the northern grasslands, mobility could become part of the answer. A family following seasonal hunting patterns required shelter that could move. The teepee solved a different problem from the earth lodge. Its poles and covering could be transported, raised, dismantled, repaired, and adjusted to wind. Interior liners and floor coverings could improve protection in cold conditions, while the central fire served cooking, light, and warmth. A teepee was not a failed permanent house. Its success depended on refusing permanence when food, fuel, or weather demanded movement. That distinction matters. A heavy wall slows temperature change. A portable wall accepts less thermal mass in exchange for access. Moving camp could place a household near a game, sheltered ground, fresh fuel, water, relatives, or a seasonal gathering place. What appears less substantial in a museum photograph may have been better suited to the year as people actually lived it. In the wooded East, timber, bark, woven mats, earth, and local building traditions produced other winter interiors. Some structures held extended families. Some communities changed residence with the seasons. Firewood might be more abundant than on open grasslands, but dampness created its own danger. A dry robe in cold air could remain protective, a wet one could become a serious problem. In parts of the southwest, winter nights could be severe, especially at elevation. Semi-subterranean rooms, compact building arrangements, thick masonry or adobe walls, timber roofs, and interior hearths helped moderate temperature. A desert landscape does not remain warm after sunset merely because it once contained sunlight. Farther north, trees could be scarce, widely scattered, or too valuable to burn carelessly. Animal fat could serve as fuel. Carefully fitted skin shelters and deeply insulating clothing preserved warmth at the scale of the body and the immediate living space. The flame might be small. The insulation could not afford to be. The decisive question was often simple. Should a household build weight into its house, or carry the house toward food? The answer shaped everything else. A settled village could support heavy timbers, thick earth, deep storage, and permanent sleeping platforms. A mobile hunting household needed materials that could be packed, repaired, and raised again before cold exhausted the people doing the work. A coastal community might organize winter food around marine resources. A river village might depend on cultivated crops, bison, trade, and stored produce. There was also no single date when the age before metal stoves ended. European and colonial trade did not reach every nation at the same time. Metal pots, knives, axes, guns, awls, pipes, and stoves entered communities through different routes and under very different conditions. Some objects were adopted quickly because they improved familiar work. Others remained rare, expensive, heavy, difficult to repair, or poorly suited to an established dwelling. A cast iron stove can be useful. It is also a large piece of cast iron. That becomes important when the house moves. Even after metal goods appeared, older technologies did not vanish in one clean transition. A family might cook in a metal kettle inside a traditional dwelling. Imported tools could be used to build or repair local architecture. A stovepipe could be fitted into a shelter whose basic design was far older than the metal passing through it. History rarely changes every object in the room on the same afternoon. People selected, traded, modified, repaired, reused, and sometimes rejected new materials according to need. The question was not whether something looked modern, it was whether it helped, what it cost, how it could be carried, and what happened when it broke. A metal stove could concentrate heat, reduce drifting smoke when properly installed, support cooking, and improve fuel control. It still needed dry fuel. It still required maintenance. It still depended on a shelter capable of retaining the warmth it produced. The older winter system did not become foolish when a new object arrived. The stove entered a world already shaped by generations of knowledge about wind, moisture, insulation, food, movement, and risk. People knew which slopes received sunlight. They knew where snow gathered deeply, where fuel could still be found, and how wind behaved around a particular camp. They understood that insulation beneath the body mattered as much as insulation above it. They knew that clothing could not remain wet, and that a shrinking cache altered every future meal. This knowledge was remembered through consequences. A seam that failed exposed skin, a roof that leaked damaged bedding, a cache that admitted moisture spoiled food. A journey begun too late could consume more energy than it returned. Children learned by watching adults scrape, dry, carry, tie, test, open, close, repair, and measure. A well-maintained winter household could therefore appear strangely calm. The roof stayed in place. The entrance remained covered. The fire remained controlled. Food emerged when needed. Moccasins remained usable. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the achievement. The most successful winter technology often prevented the event that would otherwise have become the story. And this is why the first snow is already too late to begin explaining survival. By then, the roof had either been repaired or neglected. Food had either been dried or lost. Hides had either been prepared or left unfinished. Fuel had either been gathered or remained beneath weather that would soon make every journey harder. And the late summer light, cold, still seemed distant. On the roof of an earth lodge, fresh grass and soil were pressed into a weak place anyway. The first frost would test that patch before anyone had time to admire it. On a warm afternoon beside the upper Missouri, winter could seem like a distant rumor. The river moved beneath open sky. Corn stood high in the fields. Squash leaves spread close to the ground. Sunflowers turned their dark centers toward the light. Children carried small loads, watched older relatives work, and learned that nearly every ordinary task had a second life waiting inside the cold season. A roof repaired in August became warmth in January. A hide scraped clean before autumn became bedding when the ground froze. A basket of corn dried properly became a meal after the river edges hardened with ice. This was the quiet arithmetic of winter. Nothing could be counted only once. A recorded voice from this world belongs to Maxi Diviak, known in English as Buffalo Birdwoman or Wahini. Born around 1839, she grew up in Hidatsa communities and later described gardening, childhood, household work, earth lodge life, hunting camps, and seasonal customs to Gilbert L. Wilson. Her account of Hidatsa gardening was published in 1917. It preserves remembered knowledge from a woman who had lived within the system, not a distant theory about how village life might have worked. Among the Hidatsa, women constructed, owned, and maintained earth lodges. Building one demanded far more than piling soil over a convenient hollow. The timber frame had to carry enormous weight. Central posts supported beams, smaller poles crossed the spaces between them. Willow, grass, and packed earth completed a roof thick enough to resist weather without collapsing beneath its own success. Earth is a generous insulator. It is also extremely heavy. The difference between shelter and accident lay in design, material, judgment, and inherited experience. Construction was not a burst of heroic labor followed by permanent relaxation. An earth lodge aged, rain disturbed its outer surface. Wind loosened material. Grass and soil shifted. Wooden parts weakened. The smoke opening needed attention. The covered entrance had to remain useful rather than becoming a channel for rain, mud, or drifting snow. Before cold deepened, families inspected what winter would test. Thin places on the roof received fresh material. Grass and smaller branches could be replaced. Interior sleeping areas were repaired. Mats were checked. Baskets and containers were examined for cracks. The lodge was prepared as a machine made from structure, food, fabric, fuel, memory, and people. Some of its most important parts were hidden. Beneath the floor, storage pits had to be clean, dry, and protected. These bell-shaped caches widened below a narrower opening, creating underground space for food and valuables. Their form made efficient use of the earth and allowed the entrance to be sealed. Someone standing above might notice little more than a covered place in the floor. Below it could be months of labor. Corn had to be harvested at the right stage. Ears were dried. Kernels could be removed and stored. Beans, squash, sunflower seeds, and other foods required their own preparation. Squash could be cut into thin sections so that a large, watery vegetable became lighter, smaller, and considerably less interested in rotting. Drying food was a way of shrinking summer into a form winter could store. Every handful represented work already completed: planting, tending, protecting, harvesting, carrying, cutting, drying, sorting, and sealing. A cache was not a magical hole that produced food. It was a record of successful decisions. It also invited several forms of failure. Moisture could spoil what had been stored. Insects and rodents required no invitation. A poorly sealed opening could betray the entire effort. If part of the harvest failed, admiration for the lodge walls could not replace missing calories. The harvest carried a weight that needed no invented speech. It was visible in the care given to ordinary objects. A damaged ear of corn was not merely unattractive. A cracked container was not simply untidy. Small losses accumulated, and winter possessed great patience. At the same time, hides were being transformed into clothing: robes, bags, coverings, and bedding. A fresh hide was not yet a blanket. It was wet, heavy, perishable material attached to a considerable amount of work. It had to be cleaned, scraped, stretched, dried, softened, and prepared according to its purpose. Hair might be kept for insulation or removed. Holes had to be avoided or repaired. Edges needed trimming. Tools had to remain sharp enough to work without cutting through material that could not be casually replaced. The task was exacting. The hide showed no respect for good intentions. If handled badly, it stiffened, spoiled, tore, or became less useful. If prepared well, it could hold warm air near the body, cover a sleeping place, shield someone from wind, or become part of another winter object. The phrase "natural material" can hide all of this labor. Nature supplied the beginning. Human knowledge created the robe. Fuel required the same lack of romance. Wood did not gather itself because a future fire would look beautiful. It had to be located, cut or broken, carried, protected from moisture, and used carefully. Convenient pieces near a village disappeared first. Larger fuel demanded greater effort. Wet wood produced smoke and poor heat. Green wood behaved differently from seasoned wood. A household could not build the largest possible fire every night and assume the surrounding landscape would continue supplying fuel without cost. A controlled hearth rewarded preparation. A careless blaze punished it. As autumn advanced, the days shortened and unfinished work became more serious. Roof repairs that had seemed optional became urgent. Clothing that needed mending moved to the front of the work. Food still exposed to damp air had to be handled. Tools used for planting and harvest gave way to tools needed for sowing, hunting, processing, and indoor repair. The household changed tempo. Children learned through participation suited to their age and ability. Older people contributed knowledge that prevented wasted effort. Adults carried the heaviest responsibilities, though agriculture, construction, hunting, trade, teaching, ritual life, and care never divided themselves into tidy modern categories. Winter preparation was social because no single person could perform every task well enough, quickly enough, and repeatedly enough. The popular image of survival prefers one individual alone against the cold. It is easier to place on a poster. A household was less tidy and more effective. Someone knew how the roof should be layered. Someone recognized when food was dry enough. Someone saw that a seam would fail before it opened. Someone remembered where fuel could be found. Someone noticed that a child's footwear no longer fit. Knowledge moved through hands as much as through words. By the time frost appeared in shaded places, much of the interior had already been assembled. Food waited below the floor. Robes and mats rested near the sleeping areas. The structure had been strengthened. Fuel had been gathered where possible. The central hearth remained modest, but everything that allowed it to matter was taking shape around it. Then the first sustained cold arrived. The soil on the repaired roof stiffened overnight. Wind pressed against the covered entrance. Inside, Smoke from the central fire became a daily problem rather than an occasional one. The new patch held cold pressed against the lodge from every direction. It moved across exposed ground, struck the rounded roof, and searched the entrance for a direct path inside. It cooled the outer earth. It reached for every crack, every thin place, every area where rain or wind had disturbed the covering. Yet the interior did not respond at once. That delay was the wall's great advantage. Earth does not create heat, it stores and slows it. A thick layer of soil changes temperature more gradually than a thin hide or bare board. When the air outside falls sharply after sunset, the inner surface of an earth-covered structure does not instantly become as cold as the night beyond it. The lodge gained time for the hearth to work, time for robes and bedding to hold warmth around sleeping bodies, time for cooking, movement, and human presence to add small amounts of heat to a protected room. A modern house often fights winter by producing large quantities of heat and sealing that heat behind manufactured insulation. An earth lodge followed the same physical principle, using materials available in its own landscape. It reduced the speed of loss. Trying to warm a poorly protected shelter with a larger fire is like trying to fill a basket with water. The effort can become impressive. The result remains disappointing. The earth lodge began with the basket. At Knife River, larger Upper Missouri earth lodges averaged roughly 30 feet across. 4 major central pillars carried the main beams. Numerous rafters and wall poles extended outward. Willow and grass covered the wooden framework, followed by an insulating outer layer of earth. A hole in the roof admitted some light and allowed smoke from the central hearth to escape. A movable exterior screen could help shield that vent from wind and rain. 30 feet is not a small room when the roof above it consists partly of soil. Every post carried consequence. If one support weakened, the weight did not become more forgiving. The builders needed to understand timber strength, balance, spacing, the behavior of wet earth, and how the structure would settle over time. The lodge's rounded shape and heavy covering emerged from accumulated experience rather than a casual preference for hills indoors. The smoke opening was essential and troublesome. Without it, the hearth could make the interior dangerous. With it, heat escaped. The roof therefore could not be sealed as tightly as possible. The house needed controlled breathing. The same was true at the entrance. A doorway opening directly into the main room would allow wind to push cold air toward the hearth and sleeping places. A covered passage lengthened that journey. Door coverings could slow it further. Cold air remained perfectly capable of entering, it simply had to work harder. The low-rounded exterior also met the wind without presenting a tall, flat wall. Earth blended the dwelling into the landscape. Snow collecting against parts of the structure could add temporary insulation, though excessive weight, melting, or moisture could turn that advantage into a repair problem. This was architecture bargaining with weather. The bargain demanded maintenance. If water penetrated the roof and soaked inner layers, insulation weakened. If soil washed away, thin areas formed. If supporting timbers decayed, the mass above them became dangerous. A thick roof offered protection only while the structure beneath it continued to hold. Knowledge mattered as much as material. Timber, grass, willow, and soil were not a house while lying separately on the ground. Their order created shelter. The strength of the supports mattered. The depth of the covering mattered. The slope of the roof mattered. The position of the entrance and smoke opening mattered. A family could not correct a badly framed roof in the middle of a severe night by adding confidence. The lodge was also large enough to hold an extended household. More people meant more food, bedding, supplies, movement, and work. It also meant more bodies producing heat within a protected volume. Human warmth did not replace the hearth, but it was not nothing. The room collected heat from cooking, hot food, work, bodies, and sometimes a valued animal kept near the entrance. It did not become uniformly comfortable. Instead, it developed zones. Near the fire. Hands worked. Near the walls. Supplies waited. On raised or prepared resting places, robes and mats separated bodies from colder surfaces. A person lying directly against frozen ground loses heat quickly. Place dry reeds, hide, fur, and trapped air beneath the body, and the ground's reach becomes slower. Several ordinary layers cooperate more effectively than one object expected to perform a miracle. Similar physical reasoning appeared in other regions, though the buildings belonged to different cultures and histories. Across parts of the ancient Southwest, some communities built pit houses partly below ground. Excavated floors placed living areas within earth whose temperature changed more slowly than open air. Timber, brush, and earthen roofs covered the space. Hearths supplied heat and supported cooking. Ventilation features helped manage air and smoke. Later masonry and adobe rooms used thick walls to soften temperature extremes. In high desert country, sunlight could feel generous by day, while winter darkness brought severe cold. A heavy wall slowed daytime heat entering during warm weather and slowed interior warmth leaving at night. These structures should not be folded into the Upper Missouri Earth Lodge as though they were regional versions of one universal building. They belong to different peoples, periods, and ways of life. They reveal the same physical truth. When fuel is costly, insulation becomes fuel that does not have to be burned. Every draft prevented saves wood. Every dry layer beneath a sleeper saves energy from the body. Every protected wall allows a smaller flame to accomplish more. This is why the fire cannot be understood separately from the house. A hearth in the open loses most of its heat into the night. A hearth inside a well-designed shelter gives that warmth air, surfaces, objects, and people to work upon. The result remained uneven. Space near the fire warmed first, the edges stayed cooler. Smoke could linger above. A person crossing the lodge might feel the temperature change within a few steps. There was no thermostat correcting the room in silence. People corrected it. They adjusted the fire, shifted coverings, changed position, opened or narrowed air paths, and repaired weak places. The dwelling and its occupants formed one responsive arrangement. Winter became a series of smaller problems. Wind became an entrance problem. Cold ground became a bedding problem. Rapid heat loss became a wall problem. Smoke became an airflow problem. Outside, the lodge remained a dark mound beneath the snow. Inside, the central fire brightened. Then the wind turned, and smoke flattened beneath the great wooden beams. Smoke flattened beneath the great wooden beams. A central hearth seems straightforward until a roof is placed above it. In the open, smoke rises, bends with the wind, and disappears. Inside a lodge, it meets beams, earth, stored objects, sleeping spaces, and people who would prefer not to spend the winter coughing. The opening above the fire offered smoke a route out, but it did not pull air with the steady force of a later metal chimney. The system depended on temperature, wind, the shape of the structure, and the behavior of the fire. Warm air rose toward the roof opening. Cooler air entered lower down, especially through the entrance. When conditions cooperated, this created a slow current. Fresh air moved inward. The hearth warmed it, and smoke travelled upward and out. Conditions did not always cooperate. A strong gust could disturb the rising column or force air downward through the roof opening. A weak fire might produce smoke without enough heat to lift it efficiently. Damp wood could fill the lodge with thick, irritating fumes. Too much fuel could produce flames and sparks larger than the interior safely allowed. The fire had to be watched because the air kept changing. Someone noticed when smoke began hanging lower. Someone shifted a piece of wood. Someone altered the entrance covering or responded to the wind. Someone recognized the difference between a fire that was merely small and one that was about to die. The hearth rewarded attention in small ways. A dry stick caught cleanly. Coals held enough heat to revive the flame later. A cooking vessel remained stable. Smoke rose rather than wandering among the sleeping places. Most survival work looks like this. A person moving one piece of wood several inches because experience has already explained what happens otherwise. The size of the fire mattered more than its drama. A large blaze could warm the central area quickly, but it consumed fuel rapidly. It created more smoke and increased the chance that sparks would reach dry materials. It could make the space nearest the hearth uncomfortable while doing little for the cooler edges of the lodge. A smaller fire built over dependable coals was easier to control. It supplied cooking heat, light, and warmth without requiring the household to feed it constantly. The longest useful flame mattered more than the brightest one. Fuel arrived with consequences. Every armful represented time outdoors, physical effort, and knowledge of where suitable wood could still be found. Snow made travel harder. Cold stiffened hands. Wind increased heat loss from the body. A journey to gather fuel consumed part of the energy that the fuel was meant to restore. Economy began in the walls. A well-insulated lodge could use a smaller fire than a thin, drafty shelter. Robes reduced the need to heat every corner. Cooking several foods or tasks over one hearth made better use of the same fuel. Coals preserved overnight reduced the effort required to begin again from cold ash. The hearth performed several jobs at once. Food could be cooked or warmed above it. Damp materials might be placed close enough to dry, though not close enough to scorch. Firelight extended useful work after sunset. The central area became a place for preparation, repair, teaching, conversation, and care. One source of heat shaped the geography of the room. Tasks needing light moved closer. Sleeping places remained farther from sparks and traffic. Objects that could burn had to be kept with care. Food, tools, bedding, and bodies formed a changing arrangement around the central fire. The fire was at the center, but its limits were understood. Open flames carried the possibility of burns. Clothing and robes could catch. A child moving carelessly near the hearth could turn an ordinary evening into an emergency. A shifting log might roll. A spark could land on a reed mat, remain unnoticed for a moment, and produce a bright edge where no bright edge belonged. A hand could smother it quickly. The room would smell of scorched grass. The lesson would not need repeating that night. The roof opening reduced smoke, but it also admitted wind, rain, or snow under the wrong conditions. An overturned bullboat or another movable cover could shield the opening during heavy weather while still allowing smoke to escape. The household could not seal the vent completely while the fire burned. Heat conservation had to yield to breathing. A room can be warm and unsafe. It can be smoky and still be cold. Useful shelter remained somewhere between those failures. Smoke exposure was part of the physical reality of many pre-modern interiors across the world. It could sting the eyes, irritate the throat, darken surfaces, and settle into clothing and bedding. It should not be softened into a pleasant haze because firelight looks attractive from a distance. The lodge was a working interior with real compromises. Those compromises changed through the day. Cooking produced different heat and smoke from a quiet nighttime fire. Movement near the hearth stirred the air. Opening the entrance altered the draft. A sudden gust could reverse what had been working minutes earlier. At night, another problem appeared. The fire could not rage unattended, yet allowing it to vanish completely meant losing an easy source of morning heat. The answer often lay in preserving coals rather than flames. A carefully managed hearth could settle into a low red glow, releasing heat slowly and keeping the possibility of fire alive beneath ash. This reduced fuel use and the danger of flying sparks. It also produced a different kind of warmth. Not the sharp heat of new flames, but the steady heat of stored combustion. Someone waking before dawn could move the ash, add dry material, and persuade the fire back into usefulness. Starting from nothing in cold conditions was harder. Dry tinder had to be protected. Suitable fuel had to be ready. Fingers already chilled by morning made careful work more difficult. A living coal shortened the distance between cold and heat. It connected one part of the day to another. cooking, drying, light, and comfort could resume with less effort. Yet the coal mattered only because earth walls, entrance coverings, bedding, clothing, and compact occupation preserved the little heat it released. Without them, the fire would have spent most of its strength warming the sky. The system worked because people understood its imperfections. They did not wait for an open hearth to behave like a metal stove. They shaped their routines around what it could actually do. By late evening, cooking ended, tools were put aside, a robe was drawn closer, a child settled farther from the hearth. The brighter movements of the day became smaller ones. A final piece of wood shortened into red coals. Someone drew ash over them until the glow disappeared. The glow disappeared beneath ash, but the warmest places in the lodge had already been claimed for the night. They were not always the places closest to the hearth. Near the fire, heat was strongest, but so were sparks, smoke, traffic, and interruption. Someone still needed to tend the coals or respond to the wind. The centre remained useful, but usefulness did not make it restful. Sleeping required another kind of warmth. It required distance from cold ground, protection from drafts, dry insulation, and a place where the body could remain still without surrendering heat too quickly. Around the lodge interior, sleeping platforms and prepared resting areas helped create that protection. Raised surfaces separated bedding from the coldest floor. Reed mats added a barrier. Hides and robes trapped air close to the body. Several layers held separate pockets of warmth. The bed was part of the architecture. When people lay down, movement produced less heat. During the day, work near the hearth, warm food and activity helped bodies resist cold. At night, the household preserved warmth with fewer movements and a smaller fire. The arrangement of the interior helped. The large roof supports divided the lodge into natural zones. The central space held the hearth and the brightest work. Outer areas held sleeping places, storage, tools, food containers, clothing, and the objects of daily life. Household space was not empty room waiting to be decorated. Every part had a job. Reed mats also served the waking household. At Knife River, one documented high-sided reed seat, the atuka, was associated with the oldest man of the household and could be offered to a visitor as a sign of respect. Even a seat near the fire could carry age, rank, hospitality, and practical protection from the floor. The interior map was social as well as thermal. That made disorder expensive. A basket in the wrong place could obstruct movement near the fire. Bedding too close to sparks could become dangerous. Wet material placed carelessly could dampen robes or mats. Tools needed to remain accessible without becoming hazards in the darker edges. Everyone inside learned the practical map. Children knew where movement was safe. Adults understood which objects needed warmth and which required distance. The busiest path between the entrance and hearth had to remain clear. Sleeping places were arranged away from that path when possible. The entrance shaped the room. Cold air entering through the passage tended to remain low. Anyone resting directly in its path could feel every opening of the outer covering. The space nearest the doorway was therefore not automatically desirable. Yet it might hold something extremely valuable. A prized horse could sometimes be kept near the entrance or within its protected passage. This was not a casual decision to convert the house into a stable. Horses represented mobility, hunting ability, wealth, trade value, and security. Protecting an especially important animal from theft, weather, or injury could justify giving it precious, sheltered space. The image is memorable. A household settles beneath an earth-covered roof. Coals rest in the center. Robes and mats lie around the interior. Food waits beneath the floor. Near the entrance, a horse breathes into the darkness. The horse also brings several facts that are less poetic. It occupies space. It produces moisture. It requires restraint and attention. It smells exactly like a horse, having made no promise to improve the room's atmosphere. History becomes clearer when the impressive object is allowed to remain inconvenient. The animal reveals how the household ranked danger. Sharing space could be less serious than losing the horse. Warmth, wealth, security, and mobility overlapped. Every area of the lodge therefore carried economic meaning as well as thermal meaning. A sleeping platform required timber and labour. A robe represented an animal, skilled processing, and hours of work. A basket held food or material that might be difficult to replace. Roof posts carried not only earth, but the household's future. Winter made the lodge feel full. Summer work could spread outside. Food dried in open air. Repairs used daylight and space during winter. Many activities contracted into the protected interior. The house held more supplies, more people, more tasks, and more consequences. Sound changed with that contraction. Wood shifted in the hearth. Tools scraped against hide or bone. Corn moved inside a container. Clothing was repaired. Quiet conversation passed between sleeping places and the fire. Wind crossed the roof as dull pressure rather than open force. The lodge was not silent. It was enclosed. The storm remained audible, but it no longer touched every surface of the body. The walls turned weather into sound before allowing it to become cold. Light changed as well. The hearth illuminated central posts, and the people nearest it, beyond that circle, the interior receded into softer darkness. Stored objects became outlines. The roof above disappeared partly into smoke and shadow. Anyone moving away from the fire entered a space understood more by memory than sight. Order extended the firelight. People needed to know where objects remained after the room darkened. A tool left carelessly could injure someone. A container overturned at night could waste food. A robe placed near damp material could become a mourning problem. Heat also moved unevenly. The space beside the hearth warmed first. Outer areas changed more slowly. Bedding allowed people to occupy those cooler zones, without demanding that the fire make the entire lodge equally warm. Modern heating encourages the expectation that every room should feel almost the same. The Earth Lodge offered gradients. Closer to the hearth meant more warmth and more disturbance. Farther away meant cooler air but less danger from sparks. Raised bedding improved the relationship with the floor. Robes improved the relationship with the air. Occupants adjusted to the room rather than forcing the room to meet one uniform standard. That flexibility saved fuel. The household did not need to heat the outer wall to the temperature of the central work area. It needed to keep bodies warm, food protected, tools usable, and the interior safe enough for the night. Sometimes the warmest object was not the fire. It was a robe wrapped closely around a sleeping person. It was dry grass beneath a mat. It was hot food held in both hands. It was the place where several forms of insulation happened to overlap. As the night deepened, people settled according to those small advantages. The horse near the entrance shifted its weight. Smoke thinned through the roof opening. The earth changed temperature almost too slowly to notice. Near a sleeping place, a pair of winter moccasins waited beside a robe. They were larger than the feet that would enter them. That extra space was deliberate. A lodge could slow the wind, a hearth could warm the air nearest it. Neither could follow someone outside to gather fuel, check supplies, hunt, carry water, repair a covering, or cross frozen ground. Clothing had to do that. It carried a protected climate around the body, using hide, fur, plant fibers, fitted seams, and trapped air to slow the escape of heat. The principle was already working in the lodge walls. Warmth was not produced by the material, it was held close long enough to remain useful. This is why a thin covering and a thick winter robe were not simply different quantities of the same object. Their construction changed what the body could endure. A hide with the hair retained could trap air among the fibers. Layers created more pockets of still air. A robe drawn around the torso reduced the amount of warm air continually replaced by cold wind. Leggings protected limbs. Head coverings mattered because exposed ears and faces remained vulnerable. Mittens or other hand protection preserved movement in fingers that still had work to perform. Warmth was also dexterity. Numb hands could not tie, sew, scrape, carry, repair, or control a sharp tool safely. Feet that remained cold and wet could turn a short journey into a dangerous one. A person losing too much body heat did not merely feel uncomfortable. Strength, coordination, and judgment declined. Winter clothing protected the ability to continue solving problems. As with shelter, no single clothing design belonged to every native nation. Materials and cuts varied according to climate, available animals, trade, mobility, local plants, and cultural tradition. Clothing used in an Upper Missouri village was not identical to clothing worn in Arctic Alaska, the woodlands, or the Southwest. The physical demands remained familiar. Clothing had to block wind, preserve dry insulation, allow movement, and survive repeated use when replacement required another animal and many more hours of skilled labor. Fit mattered. A garment too loose admitted moving air. One too tight compressed insulating layers and restricted motion. Winter footwear often needed extra room because insulation had to fit inside it. In some plains communities, cold-weather moccasins were intentionally made larger so fur or dry grass could be placed around the foot. At first, the solution sounds like someone had run out of proper socks and decided the prairie would provide them. The physics is better than the joke. Dry grass contains countless small spaces that trap air. Packed carefully inside footwear, it creates insulation between the foot and the outer hide. It can absorb some moisture, be removed when damp or flattened, and be replaced with fresh material. The foot was placed inside a small insulated chamber. The outer moccasin resisted abrasion and some wind. The inner material slowed heat loss. Leggings and robes continued the protection upward. Each piece handled part of the problem. The arrangement depended on dryness. Fur and plant fibers insulate most effectively when the air spaces within them remain open and relatively dry. Moisture collapses part of that advantage and allows heat to move away faster. It can freeze within clothing or footwear, stiffening the material and making movement more difficult. Drying became a daily concern. Snow brushed away before entering might remain harmless. Snow allowed to melt into bedding became a cold surprise later. Foot insulation dampened by sweat or melted snow needed attention. Robes exposed to moisture had to be positioned where they could dry without catching fire. The hearth joined the clothing system. Drying something beside an open flame required restraint. Too far away, and little happened. Too close, and the household gained the smell of scorched hide along with another fire hazard. Useful warmth lived between neglect and impatience. Clothing also required repair before small damage became serious. A loosened seam admitted wind, a tear widened with movement, a worn sole reduced protection from frozen ground. Holes did not become more considerate because the weather was severe. Needles, awls, sinew, and practiced hands kept winter clothing functional. Sinew could be processed into strong thread. Holes were pierced carefully. Seams were tightened according to the material and the garment's purpose. The work required precision, especially when light was limited and every usable piece of hide represented substantial labor. A robe could look simple when spread flat. Its simplicity had been earned. Before it became clothing or bedding, an animal had been hunted. The hide had been removed, cleaned, scraped, stretched, dried, softened, and shaped. Tools had been made and maintained. Knowledge had guided every stage. The finished object carried an entire chain of work around the person using it. That chain continued during sleep. At night, robes became portable walls. Wrapped around the body or layered over bedding, they trapped warmth that the low fire could not distribute evenly. Mats, hides, and plant material beneath the sleeper slowed heat loss into the platform or floor. Coverings above reduced loss into cooler air. Warmth travelled in both directions. A fine robe over someone lying directly on cold earth would still leave the ground performing its own quiet theft. Insulation underneath mattered as much as insulation above. Beds were assembled from layers rather than treated as single objects. Mats, dry plants, hides, fur, and robes worked together. None needed to feel warm before use. They needed to prevent existing body heat from escaping too quickly. Farther north, clothing systems became even more exacting. Among Arctic and subarctic peoples, different communities developed garments suited to conditions where exposed skin and retained moisture could become dangerous rapidly. Caribou fur was especially valuable in some northern traditions because its hairs trapped air efficiently. Carefully prepared parkas, trousers, boots, socks, mittens, and hoods formed a connected system. Layers could be arranged so fur and air spaces worked together, while still allowing movement. A missing mitten was a breach in the shelter. This reveals the weakness in the familiar idea that people survived winter through unusual toughness. Endurance mattered, but determination could not replace clothing. Frozen fingers did not become useful because a person decided to be brave. The body has rules. Successful winter technology respected them. It preserved circulation, limited wind exposure, managed moisture, and conserved energy. It also allowed adjustment. A robe could open during heavy work to reduce sweating, then close during rest. Foot insulation could be changed. A covering could move from shoulder to bed. Inside the earth, lodge clothing reduced the amount of fuel needed to keep people safe. Outside, it extended the time and distance someone could work. During sleep, it guarded warmth through the coldest hours. Still, even the finest robe could only preserve heat the body had already produced. Beside the oversized moccasins, the cover over an underground cache lifted. Dry kernels sounded softly against a container. Dry kernels sounded softly against a container. Beneath the lodge floor, the household's most important fuel had been waiting without flame. Food. The body is a furnace with very little interest in poetry. It needs energy to maintain temperature, move muscles, repair tissue, think clearly, and continue working. Cold conditions increase those demands. Warm clothing slows heat loss, but it cannot create heat from nothing. A well-insulated person who has not eaten is still running out of fuel. The winter pantry belonged to the heating system. Among the agricultural peoples of the Upper Missouri, food storage transformed a successful growing season into months of protection. Corn, beans, squash, and sunflower seeds could be dried and preserved. Meat, fat, berries, and other foods added concentrated energy and variety according to season, opportunity, and household practice. Buffalo Birdwoman's recorded account makes clear how thoroughly these stores began with women's agricultural work. Planting, protecting, harvesting, drying, carrying, and sorting crops were not background activities surrounding winter survival. They created the supply on which the cold season depended. Much of that food could be placed in underground cache pits. From the lodge floor, the opening appeared modest. Beneath it, the pit widened into a larger chamber. Its walls were prepared and lined to protect the contents from soil, moisture, insects, and animals. Food was packed inside, and the narrow entrance was sealed. The shape was practical. A small opening reduced exposure. A wider chamber below created useful volume. Surrounding earth moderated sudden temperature changes. Stored food remained out of the main room while staying close enough to retrieve during severe weather. The house became larger downward. That had an architectural advantage. Additional above-ground space would require more material and more air to warm. A cache added storage without greatly increasing the heated interior. Digging the hole was the easy part. The food entering it had to be ready. Fresh corn contained moisture. Squash contained a great deal of it. Beans and seeds could spoil if stored before they were sufficiently dry. Preservation meant controlling water long before refrigeration made cold storage appear effortless. Corn could dry on the cob or be processed further. Squash could be sliced into strips or rings, increasing the surface exposed to air. Beans and sunflower seeds required harvesting, cleaning, and drying. Meat could be cut thin and preserved through moving air, low heat, or smoke according to circumstance and practice. The purpose was to make food less welcoming to decay. A fresh squash is large, heavy, and temporary. A dried slice is smaller, lighter, and prepared to wait. That transformation required time and judgment. Food that appeared dry on the surface might still retain moisture within. Material exposed to rain or damp air needed more attention. A poor decision at the end of summer might reveal itself only when the cache was opened months later. Then, a household could discover that part of its warmth had spoiled underground. Storage was not one final act. It was the last stage of a long process. Seeds had been selected. Fields had been prepared. Plants had been tended. Animals, birds, insects, drought, excess rain, early frost, and other people could all interfere. The harvest had to be gathered, carried, processed, dried, sorted, and protected. Only then could it disappear beneath the floor. A sealed cache represented confidence, never certainty. Moisture might enter, rodents might find a weakness, insects could survive where no one expected them, a lining could fail, food could settle, crush, or become difficult to retrieve. Stores might also need protection from theft or conflict. The underground pantry was practical because very little was supposed to happen inside it. No rain, no feeding animal, no spreading mold, no curious hand opening the cover repeatedly to see whether winter food had become more exciting. The best cache was quiet. Once winter arrived, that quiet was disturbed carefully. Opening the pit exposed part of its contents to lodge air. Food was removed according to need. The entrance was covered again. Supplies had to be watched because abundance early in the season could create false confidence. A large store does not remain large after many meals. The household faced a slow calculation. How many people were eating? How much work were they doing? What might hunting, trade, or sharing provide? How long would the cold last? What reserve was needed if spring arrived late? No printed calendar promised that the weather would improve on schedule. Food had to outlast uncertainty. This encouraged careful use, not constant deprivation. People needed enough energy to work. An underfed household became less capable of gathering fuel, repairing clothing, hunting, caring for children, or responding to trouble. Saving food too aggressively could weaken the people protecting the store. Eating was maintenance. Corn offered carbohydrates the body could use for energy. Beans contributed protein and other nutrients. Sunflower seeds contained valuable fat. Squash could be combined with other ingredients. Meat and animal fat, when available, increased density and variety. The strength lay in combination. No single crop answered every need. A varied store reduced dependence on one harvest and allowed foods to support one another. It also reduced monotony, though winter meals were not designed primarily to satisfy a restaurant critic. Dried ingredients could be soaked, boiled, ground, pounded, mixed, or added to soups and stews. A vessel over the hearth turned hard, stored material into warm food. Cooking made some foods easier to eat and digest. Hot liquid also supplied immediate warmth to hands and faces near a bowl. The hearth and cache met in the cooking pot. One had preserved energy for months. The other released it within an hour. A person who ate could return to work. Someone could carry fuel, repair a seam, tend the fire, or walk into the cold with more energy available. Children could grow. Older people could be supported. The household's labour continued. Food was movement stored in advance. It was also summer land stored in advance. Each kernel carried sunlight, water, soil, and months of attention. The cache held part of another season within the winter lodge. A poor harvest entered every meal. Drought could be tasted months later. Early frost reduced the amount beneath the floor. Crop disease, flooding, insects or conflict narrowed the margin between enough and not enough. The walls might be strong. The fire might burn cleanly. The robes might remain dry. If the cache emptied too soon, every part of the household weakened. Knowledge did not guarantee abundance. Careful storage could protect food that existed. It could not preserve a harvest that had never grown. Families adapted, shared, traded, hunted, moved, and rationed, but some winters still brought hunger. As the season advanced, the cash level fell. The change remained invisible from above. The floor was covered. The lodge looked the same. Coals still glowed. Snow still rested on the roof. Below, stored summer disappeared into meals, labour, warmth, and breath. The cover settled back into place with a dull, earthen sound. The dried crops below it could carry much of a winter, but the body also needed another kind of fuel: meat, marrow, and fat. Cold weather changes the value of food. Lean meat provides protein, but protein alone does not supply all the dense energy demanded by hard winter work. Fat carries far more energy in a smaller amount. It supports sustained effort and helps turn an otherwise thin meal into something capable of carrying a person through hours outdoors. In winter, fat was stored fire. Animals carried it unevenly. Some held deposits around organs, beneath the skin, or within particular bones. Others became lean after migration, rotting, poor forage, or a difficult season. Hunters and cooks understood that two animals of similar size could offer very different winter value. A large animal without much fat could produce plenty of meat and still leave a household short of concentrated energy. This is one reason marrow mattered. Long bones could be opened to reach the rich tissue inside. Smaller bones could be crushed and boiled so grease rose to the surface. That fat could be collected, cooled, stored, and used later. The process required fuel, vessels, labour, and patience, but it recovered nourishment otherwise locked inside the skeleton. A pile of bones was not necessarily the end of a meal. It could be the beginning of another one. Meat needed preservation if it was to last. Freezing helped in cold weather, but freezing alone was not a dependable year-round plan. Temperatures changed. Animals disturbed exposed stores. Meat that thawed repeatedly or remained damp could spoil. Drying reduced that risk. Fresh meat was cut into strips or thin sections so moisture could escape. It might be placed on racks where moving air and low heat supported preservation. Smoke could contribute flavour and some protection, though the purpose was not to create a dramatic cloud around every piece. Thin pieces dried more evenly than thick ones. Meat left moist inside could spoil. Meat exposed carelessly could attract animals, insects, dust, or weather. Once dried, it became lighter and easier to store. It also became impressively committed to chewing. Dried meat could be eaten as it was, softened in liquid, pounded, or mixed with fat and plant foods. Its hardness was evidence that much of its water had been removed. Preservation allowed one successful hunt to continue feeding people after the animal itself had vanished from view. The hunt remained uncertain. Snow revealed tracks. Yet deep snow slowed travel. Wind covered signs. Animals moved according to their own needs rather than the household menu. Hunters spent energy before gaining any. A long search might return nothing except colder hands and a deeper appreciation for food already stored at home. Every journey required calculation. How far could someone travel safely? What weather was approaching? How much food would the hunt consume? Could an animal be carried or processed before conditions changed? Was the expected return worth the risk? Hunting was skilled work, performed against uncertainty, not a guaranteed delivery service conducted with traditional equipment. A successful hunt produced another surge of labour. The animal had to be butchered. Meat had to be separated, carried, cut, and preserved. Fat needed protection. Hides, sinew, bones, and other materials could become clothing, tools, thread, containers, and household equipment. Very little ended when the animal fell. That was when the work became crowded. Cold could help preserve meat during processing, but it also stiffened hands and materials. Daylight was limited. Predators and scavengers might arrive. The household had to decide what to transport first and what could safely remain. The animal entered winter life in parts. Muscle became food. Fat became dense energy. Marrow became nourishment recovered from bone. Hide became bedding or clothing. Sinew became thread. Bone became tools and raw material. The value of the hunt depended partly on how completely the animal could be used. Among some plains peoples, dried meat and rendered fat could be combined, sometimes with crushed berries in forms of pemmican. Preparations varied by community and circumstance. There was no single continent-wide recipe. The principle was powerful. Dry meat supplied protein, rendered fat supplied concentrated energy, berries could contribute flavor and nutrients. Pounded and mixed together, the ingredients formed compact food suited to travel and storage. It was transportable winter security. A small amount carried substantial energy. It could support hunting, movement, trade, and periods when cooking was difficult. Its later value to fur traders and other travelers did not create the knowledge behind it. They encountered an indigenous technology already refined for demanding conditions. Efficiency still rested on preparation. Meat had to be dry. Fat had to be rendered and protected. The mixture had to remain free from moisture and contamination. A famous preserved food did not become safe when handled carelessly. Fat could also be stored separately and added to soups, corn dishes, beans, or dried meat. A modest amount changed the energy value of a meal greatly. A bowl that looked small could carry strength if it contained fat. A large bowl of thin food might fill the stomach while leaving the body short of fuel. Winter meals balanced volume, availability, and density. Corn and beans supported steady nourishment. Meat supplied protein. Fat concentrated energy. Squash, seeds, and berries added variety. Hot broth warmed the body and softened dried ingredients. The most dependable meals combined different parts of the food system. Agriculture reduced dependence on the hunt. Hunting reduced dependence on the harvest. Stored fat strengthened lean foods. Dried supplies waited when fresh food could not be found. This diversity acted like another layer of insulation. A failed hunt was less dangerous while caches remained full. A damaged harvest was less dangerous when hunting. Trade or sharing could help close the gap. Food moved between relatives and households through obligation, exchange, ceremony, and care. Security extended beyond the lodge walls. That did not mean food was always distributed perfectly or that no one went hungry. Scarcity strained relationships. Some households had more than others. Illness or injury reduced the ability to hunt or process food. Conflict could interrupt movement and trade. Still, cooperation created options. Solitary survival did not. A person alone might preserve food. A community could preserve people. Inside the lodge, a winter meal gathered all of these systems into one bowl. Crops grown months earlier, meat obtained through dangerous work, fat recovered through careful processing, and water heated by fuel carried through snow. The food warmed the hands first, then the mouth, then the body. Afterward, its energy became movement. Someone fed the half. Someone repaired a seam. Someone lifted a child. Someone prepared for another journey outside. By late winter, however, every reserve had diminished. Cache pits were lower. Dried meat bundles were smaller. Fat had been scraped repeatedly from its container. At the bottom, a pale curved mark showed where the last spoonful had passed. A pale curved mark showed where the last spoonful of fat had passed. Across the lodge, 5 small tasks continued around the same low fire. A moccasin rested in one pair of hands. Its sole had worn thin near the front, where repeated steps pressed hide against frozen ground. An awl opened careful holes. Sinew followed. The repair was not elegant enough to become ceremonial art, but it might decide whether someone could gather wood without returning with a numb foot. Near the hearth, another person watched the coals. A piece of wood was placed where it would catch slowly rather than flare. A cooking vessel warmed beside it. Dried corn and beans needed time and heat before they became a meal. Fuel used too quickly for brightness would not be available later for cooking or drying. A child watched both tasks. No formal lesson had been announced. None was needed. The child could see where the awl entered, how tightly the sinew was drawn, which pieces of wood smoked, and how the pot was positioned. A small question might be answered, a mistake might be corrected. The movements would be repeated on another night until knowledge settled into the hands. Beyond the brightest circle, someone who could not work fully rested beneath a robe. Illness, age, or injury did not suspend the household's needs. Water still had to be warmed, food still had to be prepared. The person near the bed adjusted a covering and then returned to the hearth. 5 tasks, 1 room. No task existed alone. The earth lodge was not warmed by architecture alone. People repaired the architecture. The hearth produced heat because someone gathered fuel, protected the coals, and cleared the space around it. Food emerged from a cache because many hands had planted, harvested, dried, stored, measured, and cooked it. Even rest depended on work performed by someone else. A robe remained warm because it had been processed and mended. A sleeping place stayed dry because a leak had been noticed. A meal appeared because someone stood beside the fire long enough to make hard food edible. Winter turned a household into a network of small obligations. Some were obvious. A damaged roof demanded attention. A low fuel supply could not be ignored. Hunters had to prepare before leaving and process whatever they brought back. Other tasks were ordinary enough to disappear from history. Water still had to be obtained. Tools became dull. Cordage frayed. Clothing tore. Children grew out of things at the least convenient moment. A household could survive a storm and spend the next morning in a long disagreement with a broken strap. The work did not divide itself according to what a modern audience finds dramatic. Hunting carried risk and importance, but so did keeping food dry. Constructing an earth lodge required strength and architectural knowledge, but winter clothing also determined who could leave that lodge safely. A hunter with damaged footwear could not travel effectively. A cook without fuel could not soften stored food. The child without instruction might waste supplies or approach the hearth carelessly. An older person whose knowledge was ignored could watch a preventable error become expensive. The household survived by keeping those connections intact. Buffalo Bird Woman's published life story reflects how closely these parts overlapped. Its remembered subjects include winter camp, storytelling, life in an earth lodge, childhood games, kinship, learning to work, corn husking, and hunting camp. The categories belong together because winter knowledge did not arrive as one lecture. It was absorbed within family life. Inside the lodge, many tasks moved toward the fire because light was limited. Hides were repaired. Sinew was prepared for sewing. Stone, bone, antler, or wooden tools were sharpened, shaped, or fitted with new handles. Nothing remained useful forever, merely because it had been made well. A scraper wore down. An awl became blunt. A cord frayed. A wooden vessel cracked. Repair was part of an object's expected life. Possessions could not be discarded casually when replacement existed only as raw material, labour, travel, and knowledge. A damaged item had to be examined. Could it be patched? Could one part be replaced? Could the material be reused for something smaller? A torn robe might supply patches after its life as a full covering ended. Worn hide could become ties. Bone fragments could become tools. The final stage of an object was rarely determined by its first job. Winter offered time for such work, though long evenings did not make it effortless. Firelight illuminated details unevenly. Smoke irritated eyes. Fingers tired. Dry materials could stiffen. The household worked within those limits because spring would arrive with demands of its own. Hunting equipment needed preparation. Agricultural tools required maintenance. Containers had to be ready for another season of gathering and storage. Winter was not empty time between important months. It was the workshop in which part of the next year was assembled. It was also a classroom and a place of memory. In many native communities, particular stories, teachings, games, or ceremonies belonged to particular seasons. Cold months created time for narratives that connected children to relatives, animals, places, histories, and rules larger than one household. Stories also made darkness easier to inhabit. This was practical. People shared limited space for long periods. Weather restricted movement. Food variety narrowed. Smoke, noise, illness, and ordinary irritation remained close at hand. Companionship helped the household function. So did humor, a boast ending badly? An animal behaving with inconvenient intelligence? Or a person receiving the result of poor judgment could become a story? Humor relieved tension, but it also taught what a community admired, distrusted, or considered foolish. A warning attached to laughter was easier to remember than a lecture. Care work remained quieter. Infants needed warmth, food, and constant attention. Older people or anyone injured or ill might require help with ordinary tasks. Someone weakened by fever could not contribute an equal share simply because fairness preferred symmetry. Labour shifted according to ability and need. An extended household could redistribute work. A person unable to travel might repair tools, prepare food, teach children, or contribute knowledge. A strong adult could gather fuel for several people. Older children could care for younger ones while other work continued. Difference strengthened the household more than identical performance. Cooperation had limits. Crowded living could spread illness. Smoke could worsen breathing problems. If several people became sick, the system lost labour precisely when it required more care. Harmony was not guaranteed either. People could be tired, worried, annoyed, or in disagreement. Survival has never required constant cheerfulness. It requires enough coordination to keep the fire from going out. By morning, the lodge showed the result of another evening. The moccasin had a new line of stitches. The food had softened. Damp material had dried. The resting person had been checked. The child had learned where the awl was stored. Outside, winter still covered the village. Inside, the household had served as its own repair shop, classroom, kitchen, and emergency service. Beyond the village, however, some families met winter inside houses that had no intention of remaining in one place. Beyond the village, some families met winter inside houses that had no intention of remaining in one place. An earth lodge answered cold with mass. A tipi answered with movement. The contrast can make the portable dwelling appear weaker. Its covering was thinner. Its floor did not sit beneath heavy earth. Its walls could not store warmth as slowly as an earth-covered roof. But a winter home remained useful only while food and fuel stayed within reach. If game moved, nearby wood diminished, or a camp became exposed to worsening conditions, the ability to leave could be more valuable than another foot of wall. Mobility was architecture designed around departure. Among plains peoples, teepees differed in size, pole arrangement, covering, decoration, interior organization, and seasonal use. They should not be treated as one identical design shared across every nation. Yet the broad conical form reveals why the dwelling worked for communities whose lives required regular movement. Long poles created a strong frame with relatively little weight. A fitted covering enclosed the structure. An opening at the top allowed smoke to escape. Adjustable flaps could respond to wind. The entrance could be oriented and protected according to conditions and local practice. Every feature had to work while remaining portable. A heavy roof would have held warmth longer, but it could not be transported easily. Thick masonry resisted wind, but could not follow a hunting camp. The teepee gave up thermal mass in exchange for speed, adaptability, and access to changing resources. It entered a different contest from the earth lodge. Once raised, the sloping form met wind without presenting a broad, flat wall. The central fire warmed the occupied space, and smoke moved toward the opening above. Wind direction still mattered. The flaps required adjustment. A poorly chosen camp or a sudden change in weather could make the interior smoky, drafty, or difficult to heat. Portability did not make the air more obedient. In some documented winter configurations, an interior liner created a second wall around the lower part of the teepee. Cold air entering near the ground moved into the space between liner and outer cover. The liner reduced direct drafts at body level and helped guide the movement of air upward toward the smoke opening. A light second wall could change how the whole room behaved. Floor coverings added another defense. Hides, robes, mats and dry vegetation reduced contact with frozen or snow-covered ground. Bedding was placed where sparks and smoke were less troublesome. Tools, food, and containers occupied the perimeter, but the entire arrangement had to remain capable of becoming a load again. Nothing could become too permanently comfortable. That was the price of mobility. A family might spend hours raising and arranging a camp that would later disappear. Poles came down. Coverings were folded. Bedding, tools, food, and containers were bundled. The house returned to separate pieces and moved across the landscape. The labor was not wasted. Rebuilding warmth somewhere else was the purpose. Movement could place a household nearer animals, sheltered terrain, water, relatives, or fresh fuel. It allowed people to respond to local conditions rather than enduring one location until its resources failed. A permanent house concentrated security. A portable one allowed security to change places. The decision to move was never free. Travel consumed energy. Snow slowed people and animals. Poles, coverings, food, bedding, and tools had weight. Children, older people, and anyone ill or injured still had to reach the next camp. A journey promising better hunting could weaken a household before it arrived. Weather might change after departure. The old camp had already been made livable. The next existed only as a location and a plan. For a time, the shelter stood neither behind nor ahead of the people carrying it. This narrow interval made knowledge and cooperation visible. Large poles required handling. Coverings had to be packed so they remained usable. Bedding needed protection from snow. A child who became cold during travel could not wait until the architecture was finished before needing care. The campsite mattered almost as much as the teepee. Terrain could block part of the wind. Nearby fuel reduced the cost of maintaining a fire. Water or usable snow mattered. Drainage mattered when weather changed. The ground had to support the poles and provide room for the camp. A beautiful view was optional. A windbreak was not. Once the structure stood, the layered winter logic returned. Snow around the lower edge could sometimes help block moving air, but it had to be managed rather than trusted blindly. Drifting could press against the covering, and melting could wet materials meant to remain dry. The entrance opened repeatedly as people carried fuel, food, and equipment inside. Each opening briefly redrew the airflow around the fire. A portable home still demanded constant reading of wind, ground, flame, and fabric. The fire released heat. The liner interrupted drafts. Floor coverings slowed loss into the ground. Robes protected bodies. Food replaced energy. People watched the weather and adjusted the interior. The most obvious difference was that the entire arrangement could be dismantled. That changed repair as well. A covering had to resist wind and snow, but also survive folding, transport, handling, and repeated setup. Pole damage could delay shelter. The torn cover admitted air. A damaged liner weakened protection near the floor. Maintenance travelled with the family. So did the knowledge of sequence, pole order, balance, cover placement, smoke flap control, entrance orientation, and interior arrangement were not decorative traditions attached to a simple tent. They were the design. Someone unfamiliar with that design might see poles and hides. A knowledgeable household saw a series of actions that had to occur before cold exhausted the workers. Speed could become warmth. Cooperation created the room. The frame rose. The covering tightened. Household goods moved inside. Fire material was found. Children and vulnerable family members received protection while the shelter took shape. Then the temporary interior could feel settled despite having no foundation. Wind remained beyond the lower liner. Smoke moved above the occupied space. Food warmed over the hearth. People rested beside objects that had travelled with them. The camp was temporary. The household was not. A family could leave one place without abandoning its tools, bedding, knowledge, social relationships, or identity. Home existed partly in the shelter and partly in the practiced ability to build it again. For mobile communities, that ability could be safer than remaining inside a stronger house after surrounding resources failed. At dawn, the lodge bundles were tied, poles lifted, the old hearth darkened behind them. Fresh snow began filling the circles where the beds had been. Those disappearing bed circles belonged to the plains. Farther north, in the Brooks Range of Alaska, Nunavut Inupiat families carried another form of winter home through a landscape shaped by caribou, long darkness, powerful wind, and limited wood. This was not the solution of every Arctic people, and it did not remain unchanged across the entire North. The example belongs specifically to Nunavut life, in which mobility and close knowledge of migrating caribou shaped food, shelter, clothing, tools, and movement. For a Nunavut household, the caribou provided far more than meat. Hide became clothing and shelter. Sinew became thread. Rawhide became lashing. Fat became food and sometimes lamp fuel. Bone and antler became useful material. The animal entered nearly every part of the winter system. The traditional caribou skin tent, called an itchalik, was not a thin cover placed casually over sticks. A typical site could be cleared into an oval roughly 15 feet across. The pole frame needed balance. Prepared skins had to be fitted, sewn, carried, raised, and maintained. An itchalik could shelter as many as 10 people. One skilled person might erect it, though husband and wife commonly worked together. The lower edge required particular care. Thick moss could be packed around the base to block drafts. A person outside might see a low, skin-covered form in the snow. Inside, that ring of moss stopped moving air at the exact level where sleepers and seated people would feel it most. Caribou skins supplied further insulation. Hair trapped air. Multiple layers created protection suited to movement. Because skins were lighter and more portable than soil or stone, the shelter could be dismantled when the family moved and raised again, where hunting and seasonal needs required. The caribou was not merely hunted near the home. In a physical sense, it became the home. Inside, fresh willow branches could be laid down to create a softer floor. The sleeping area might contain 3 distinct layers of caribou skin. First came coarse, unscraped hides from bull caribou as a floor covering. Above them rested individual mattresses made from the hides of young fall bulls. Soft, carefully tanned summer calf or cow skins formed warm blankets over the sleepers. 3 layers stood between a resting body and frozen ground, each selected and prepared for a different job. During the day, mattresses and blankets could be rolled against the walls and used as backrests. At night, the room changed shape again. Bedding spread across the willow and lower hides. Clothing, shelter, and sleeping materials became overlapping forms of insulation built from related knowledge. A person could rise from a caribou skin bed, dress in caribou skin clothing, and pass through a caribou skin wall into winter. Each layer met the cold before the body did. This made sewing a form of engineering. A weak seam in a decorative object might disappoint. A weak seam in a parka or tent admitted moving air, moisture, or snow. Stitch placement, sinew condition, hide preparation, and the shape of each piece mattered because the finished object had to bend without opening. The interior was not heated to modern expectations. A lamp burning seal oil or caribou fat could provide heat and light through long darkness. Its flame was far smaller than an earth lodge hearth. Inside a compact, well-insulated shelter, modest heat still mattered. The lamp illuminated hands, food, tools, sewing, and the nearest faces. Beyond its circle, the interior softened into shadow. Animal fat was valuable food, so burning it required judgment. A controlled wick offered light and warmth without consuming fuel too quickly. The flame did not need to brighten a hall, it needed to serve the work immediately around it. Cooking fires could be maintained outside rather than filling the skin tent with the smoke and risk of a large open hearth. Stones heated in that fire could be carried inside to add warmth. A hot stone released no indoor smoke and required no chimney. Its heat faded. But inside layered skins and sealed lower walls, even temporary warmth was useful. The arrangement remained practical rather than effortless. Snow carried inside on clothing could melt. Damp skins lost some insulating value. Footwear and garments needed drying without being scorched. Bedding required protection. The lamp needed fuel. The moss seal had to remain tight. The tent covering had to withstand wind and repeated handling. Cold made every small failure more expensive. That was especially true during movement. A portable shelter protected a family only after it had been raised. Before that, skins, poles, bedding, food, lamps, clothing and tools existed as loads. Nunavut groups moved according to caribou migrations and seasonal needs. Mobility brought access to animals, but exposed people between camps. A family leaving a working shelter surrendered a successful interior before the next one existed. At the new site, the oval had to be cleared. Poles were positioned, skins were secured, moss was pressed around the bottom, willow branches and bedding were arranged. The lamp was prepared. A hurried gap in the wall would continue reminding everyone of itself until corrected. Dependence on caribou created strength and risk at the same time. When herds were available, they supplied meat, fat, hides, sinew, rawhide, and bone. When hunting failed or migration routes became difficult to reach, several parts of winter life weakened together. Nunavut knowledge therefore extended beyond making objects. Hunters learned the migration paths of caribou and the ways local terrain channeled moving herds. Families placed camps within a seasonal landscape rather than selecting isolated patches of ground. The Itchalik worked because it could move within that wider map. Shelter knowledge and animal knowledge were parts of the same decision. Food diminished. Lamp fuel became more precious. New clothing material became harder to obtain. Shelter repairs became difficult. This was not one clever survival trick. It was an integrated system with powerful advantages and serious points of failure. The Italik could move. Caribou skins insulated well. Clothing extended protection beyond the tent. A small lamp or heated stones contributed warmth without demanding a large indoor wood fire. Every advantage rested on animal availability, sewing skill, dry material, environmental knowledge, and cooperation. Before sleep, someone could roll a warmed stone nearer the bedding, check the moss at the wall, and turn damp footwear toward the lamp. Each movement protected a different part of the night. Outside, darkness surrounded the tent. Inside, the lamp remained low. Its light touched the nearest skins and disappeared into their hair. Wind pressed the walls, but moss held at the lower edge. Beside the sleeping place, 3 different layers of caribou hide remained exactly where they had been laid. The 3 layers remained in place, but winter needed only one opening elsewhere. A small leak began in the roof of an earth lodge during a period of melting snow. At first, it produced no emergency. A little moisture darkened part of the inner covering. A container was moved. Someone marked the place for repair when the weather allowed. Then the temperature fell again. The damp area froze. More moisture entered during the next thaw. A sleeping mat near the wall became wet at one edge. Bedding had to be moved closer to the occupied center, where space was already crowded. One person slept badly. Poor sleep reduced strength the next morning. The trip for fuel was shorter than planned. Less wood returned to the lodge. The fire remained smaller. Damp material dried slowly. Smoke from inferior fuel lingered lower beneath the roof. A roof leak had become a bedding problem, then a labor problem, then a fuel problem, then an air problem. This is how winter systems often failed, not through one spectacular collapse, but through consequences passing from one part of the household into another. Skill reduced danger. Preparation widened the margin for survival. Cooperation allowed a family to absorb problems that would overwhelm one person. None of it made people invulnerable. The earth lodge could hold warmth, yet its hearth produced smoke. On a favourable day, warm air rose cleanly through the roof vent. When wind shifted, smoke could hang lower, sting eyes, settle into clothing, and make breathing difficult. The fire could be adjusted. Airflow could be changed. No switch removed every particle from the room. Open flame created another risk. A spark could reach dry material. A robe might fall too close. A child could stumble. A cooking vessel could overturn. Someone moving beside the hearth in darkness could place a hand or foot where heat remained hidden beneath ash. The fire protected the household from cold while carrying its own danger at the centre. Water was equally deceptive. A wet hide became heavier and less insulating. Damp plant fibres lost trapped air. A wet sleeping place drew heat from the body throughout the night. Clothing soaked by melting snow could freeze, stiffen, and restrict movement. Cold and wet together were more dangerous than either alone. This is why the leaking roof mattered. The water did not remain in one category. It damaged sleep, weakened people, complicated fire management, and consumed labour that had been needed elsewhere. Food stores could fail through a similar chain. A cache might appear secure above while moisture entered below. Rodents could breach the lining. Mould could spread through food stored too damp. A household might open the pit expecting months of security and discover that part of the harvest was no longer safe. The loss included more than food. It erased work already invested in planting, tending, harvesting, drying, carrying, and storing. Those months could not be repeated in January. The empty space in a damaged cache could not be repaired with extra effort that evening. Winter had placed time itself beyond reach. Hunting might help, but hunting answered to weather, animal movement, health, and chance. Tracks vanished beneath fresh snow. Deep drifts slowed travel. A storm could trap hunters away from camp or prevent departure altogether. A failed hunt consumed food and strength without returning either. The cold did not care that the decision had been sensible. Fuel also became scarce. The nearest dry wood was gathered first. Later journeys lengthened. Snow covered fallen branches. Wet or green fuel produced more smoke and less useful heat. Someone had to spend energy outside to bring warmth inside. If illness or injury reduced the household's labour, the hearth shrank. A smaller fire meant colder hands, slower cooking, and more difficult drying. Frozen ingredients took longer to prepare. Morning began inside a colder room. Warmth, food preparation, drying, and light all competed for the same fuel. Illness intensified every competition. Crowded winter homes allowed people to share warmth and work, but close quarters also helped sickness move between them. Smoke could worsen irritated lungs. A person with fever or breathing difficulty required water, food, warmth, and care from people already performing ordinary winter tasks. If several members became sick, the household lost labour precisely when care increased. Infants depended entirely on others. They could not adjust bedding or move away from a draft. Older people might carry essential knowledge but have less strength for travel. A serious cut, burn, damaged foot, or fall could remove a healthy adult from fuel gathering or hunting. There was no separate emergency service beyond the entrance. Relatives and neighbouring households widened protection. They could share food, shelter, labour, information, and care. Severe winters, however, could place many families under pressure at once. Sharing was powerful. It did not create unlimited supplies. Conflict, theft, warfare, colonial disruption, and forced movement could separate families from caches, hunting grounds, fuel, building materials, and established winter camps. A lodge protected people only while they could reach it. Stored food remained useful only while its owners retained access. Survival knowledge was tied to place. Displacement weakened that knowledge by removing people from familiar animal routes, plant areas, fuel sources, architecture, and social support. Weather alone could exceed expectation. Snow might block travel longer than remembered patterns suggested. Sudden warming created wet conditions, followed by freezing that hardened the surface. Spring could arrive late. No reserve was endless. Near the close of winter, an interior might look almost unchanged. The same posts stood around the hearth. The same entrance interrupted the wind. The same robes covered sleeping places. The differences were small and cumulative. A patch crossed a moccasin. A repaired seam showed on a robe. The wood pile had diminished. The cache held less food. Months of supplies had been converted into heat, movement, care, and breath. Some winters ended with loss. People became ill. Food failed. Animals could not be found. Families mourned. Sophisticated knowledge does not erase suffering. It explains how households endured conditions that remained difficult, dangerous, and sometimes deadly. The earth lodge did not work because its occupants possessed a mysterious tolerance for cold. It worked because people understood soil, timber, air, clothing, food, and one another. The teepee did not make movement easy. The caribou skin tent did not make Arctic cold ordinary. These technologies were precise because imprecision carried consequences. Back in the lodge with the leaking roof, the damp robe hung near the hearth. The fuel pile was too small to build a stronger fire. No one could wear it safely into the wind. By morning, the robe was still wet. The wet robe was one reminder that older systems carried real limits. During the winter of 1804 to 1805, metal did something revealing near the Mandan and Hidatsa villages. At Fort Mandan, members of the Lewis and Clark expedition took a damaged sheet iron stove and cut it apart. The blacksmiths turned its metal into trade goods, battle axes, arrow points, and scrapers used in preparing hides. The stove did not arrive as a sacred symbol of progress. It arrived as useful material, and useful material could be assigned another job. That episode captures how metal entered older winter systems, not as one sudden replacement, but object by object, tool by tool, and decision by decision. The Knife River villages had already served as major indigenous trade centres for centuries. After 1750, they also became important marketplaces within the expanding fur trade. Agricultural produce, hides, clothing, tools, stone, shells, and information had long moved through regional networks before imported sheet iron appeared. These communities were not waiting in isolation for trade to begin. In February 1805, William Clark noted that the expedition's blacksmiths were receiving corn in payment for their labour. Sheet iron was especially valued because it could be made into arrow points and tools for scraping and dressing bison robes. The exchange joined imported material to indigenous food production and hide work in one practical transaction. Metal mattered because people already knew exactly what they wanted it to do. A kettle might arrive before a stove, an axe could appear before a pipe, an awl could change sewing without altering the shape of the house. Metal was valued partly because it could be reshaped after its first use ended. A damaged kettle was not automatically rubbish. Sheet metal could become points, blades, scrapers, ornaments, patches, or repair material. An iron tool reduced the time needed to cut wood or shape another object. A metal awl could pierce hide repeatedly and remain serviceable through heavy work. New material entered existing chains of knowledge. An axe did not explain how an earth lodge should be framed. A kettle did not grow the corn placed inside it. A scraper did not prepare a hide without skilled hands. A wood-burning stove represented a larger change because it altered the behavior of fire indoors. Combustion could be enclosed inside metal instead of exposed in the center of the floor. Heat radiated from the stove surface. Fuel could be added through an opening and controlled more precisely. Smoke traveled through a pipe rather than spreading freely beneath the roof. The benefits could be immediate. Less smoke drifted among the occupants when the installation worked properly. Sparks were contained more effectively. Cooking vessels rested on a stable heated surface. The household could maintain useful heat with more control than an open hearth allowed. The stove reorganized labor rather than eliminating it. Fuel still had to be located, cut, transported, and kept dry. A pipe needed a safe path through a wall or roof. Surrounding material required protection from heat. Ash accumulated, metal rusted, loosened, warped, or cracked. A replacement part might be impossible to obtain when it failed. The stove could burn fuel more efficiently and still become a very heavy passenger. A broken hinge or separated pipe could also turn useful iron into a repair problem far from a blacksmith. Inside a permanent dwelling, it remained in place. Inside a mobile shelter, its body, pipe, tools, and fuel joined every load that people or animals carried. Adoption therefore depended on circumstance. A settled winter residence might benefit greatly. A mobile hunting group had to weigh better heat control against transport, fuel availability, and repair. A stove useful during one season might be less practical during another. Among the Nunavut, wood-burning stoves were eventually fitted into the older caribou skin tent system. The Ichalik was modified rather than instantly abandoned. A sheet metal collar could be sewn into the skin cover. The stovepipe passed through this protected opening, so the hot metal did not touch and burn the hides. The image makes the transition visible. Caribou skins still formed the shelter. Moss could still block drafts at the base. Traditional sewing knowledge still held the structure together. A metal pipe now rose through a carefully prepared collar. The new technology depended on the old dwelling accommodating it. The collar had to be secure, the pipe needed stability and wind, sparks leaving its top could not fall onto vulnerable material. The stove required distance from bedding, clothing, skins, and household goods. An enclosed fire reduced some risks and introduced others. The tent did not become fireproof because the flame had entered a box. The stove also changed the rhythm of heat. A lamp produced modest warmth within a heavily insulated interior. A wood stove could create a stronger hot zone, warm the shelter more quickly, dry clothing faster, and support certain forms of cooking. It could also consume fuel rapidly when used without care. The largest fire was still not necessarily the most useful one. On the upper Missouri, changes in housing became entangled with epidemic disease, warfare, colonial settlement, reservation boundaries, government policy, and economic pressure. These forces altered where people could live and how communities organized themselves. During the second half of the 19th century, timber-framed houses gradually replaced many earth lodges as primary residences among the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara, although earth lodges continued into the 20th century in ceremonial and secondary roles. This change should not be told as a simple contest in which a superior house defeated an inferior one. The earth lodge belonged to a settled agricultural life, supported by village labor, local building materials, trade, kinship, and a particular social world. When that world was devastated, restricted, or reorganized, architecture changed with it. A timber house with a metal stove belonged to a different material chain. Boards had to be cut or obtained. Nails, glass, hardware, pipe, stove parts, and replacement pieces connected the household more closely to markets and outside suppliers. New houses offered real comforts while creating new dependencies. Families did not judge these changes through a clean argument between tradition and modernity. They kept what remained useful, modified what could be improved, adopted what solved a problem, and sometimes lost practices under pressure rather than choice. The stove did not know when food should be dried. It could not sew footwear, read the wind, locate game, protect a child, organize labor, or decide when supplies had to be shared. Metal enclosed the fire. Winter survival still surrounded it. Late at night, iron cooled with small ticking sounds beside traditional bedding. No one needed to announce that two technological worlds occupied the same room. Their coexistence needed no announcement. Long before the stove arrived, families had learned to divide winter into smaller problems. Wind could be slowed at an entrance. Frozen ground could be separated from a sleeper. Smoke could be guided toward an opening. Hunger could be delayed inside a cache. Wet clothing could be dried. Distance could be answered with movement. Work could be shared before exhaustion reached one person alone. By late winter, these lessons were visible everywhere inside an earth lodge. A patch crossed the roof where new material had been added during warmer weather. The entrance covering showed wear from months of lifting, closing, and testing against the wind. A sleeping robe carried several careful repairs. A moccasin sole had been reinforced where frozen ground had worn it thin. The household had become a record of the season. Food stores were lower, nearby fuel was harder to find. Tools had been sharpened repeatedly. People had grown accustomed to darkness arriving early and work continuing beside a smaller flame. The dramatic moments had been rare. Most nights, no storm tore the roof away. No fire escaped the hearth. No cache failed completely. Instead, the family survived through events too ordinary to become legends. Someone noticed smoke settling lower than usual. Someone moved a piece of wood. Someone found dampness before it reached the bedding. Someone took only what was needed from the cache. Someone replaced the grass inside a child's winter footwear. Someone woke before the others and found a living coal beneath ash. That was how the season passed, through corrections made before failure had time to grow. Outside, winter slowly weakened. The change was not generous. Daylight lasted slightly longer, but mornings remained bitter. Snow softened beneath afternoon sun and froze after dark. Travel could become more difficult as powder changed to crust, then slush, then ice. Spring did not arrive as a clean release. It argued with winter for the landscape. The household still needed fuel, food still had to last, clothing still had to remain dry. A late storm could erase several days of hope and bury familiar paths again. No one could eat the promise of warmer weather. The cache remained important until new food could actually be obtained. Stored corn did not become unnecessary because sunlight entered the lodge at a different angle. Dried meat and fat did not lose value because the river had begun to change. The final stretch could be among the hardest. Supplies were lowest after months of cold. Clothing showed wear. Bodies carried fatigue. The nearest fuel had often been gathered long before. Longer days nevertheless offered possibilities. Travel became easier under certain conditions. Animals changed movement. Snow released portions of the ground. Work that had waited for better weather could soon move outdoors. Attention shifted gradually. Winter work had preserved. Spring work would renew. Tools repaired beside the hearth would return to fields, riverbanks, hunting areas, and building sites. Seeds protected through the cold would be brought into daylight. Robes used every night would be cleaned, aired, mended, or stored differently. The house would change with the season. An entrance held tightly through winter could admit more air. Dampness required attention as snow melted around the structure. The roof needed inspection after months beneath wind, ice, and accumulated weight. The same earth that slowed heat loss could hold unwanted moisture when neglected. A winter shelter did not stop demanding care when the weather improved. It presented new problems. This is why the metal stove never explains the full story. A stove could warm a room in January. It could not repair a roof in August, protect a harvest in October, recognize damp bedding in February, or notice meltwater entering in March. The winter system extended through the year. Its beginning could not be located at the first snowfall. Its ending could not be located at the final fire. For Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara families of the Upper Missouri, seasonal life connected fields, river, bison hunting, trade, architecture, kinship, and household labor. The lodge stood near the center of that world without being separate from it. Its timbers came from the landscape, its earth covering came from the ground, its food came from cultivated fields, hunts, trade, and sharing. Its robes came from animals transformed through skilled work. Its warmth emerged from all of them together. Different environments produced different arrangements. The Plains teepee carried household continuity across distance. Nunamiut caribou skin tents turned hides, sinew, moss, bedding, clothing, and a modest flame into protection in the Brooks Range. What joined these histories was not one universal native technique. It was the refusal to depend on one fragile answer. A fire could die, a hunt could fail, a seam could open, a storm could last longer than expected. Survival became more likely when the household had another layer, another source of food, another skilled person, or another place to move. These knowledge systems did not simply vanish when stoves, framed houses, reservation life, and new markets changed the material world. Native families continued to adapt, preserve, teach, and renew practices under conditions often imposed upon them. The houses and tools changed unevenly. The intelligence connecting food, shelter, weather, and community remained alive. These acts left few spectacular monuments. A repaired moccasin rarely enters history beside a battle. A carefully sealed cache does not announce itself in a proclamation. The person who kept bedding dry through a storm may never appear by name in a written record. Yet such acts carried communities through the season. History continued because someone performed them. Before sunrise, the lodge was nearly dark. The central fire had collapsed into a shallow bed of coals. No flame rose above them. Their red light appeared only when ash shifted and a narrow crack opened across the surface. Around the hearth, the household remained still. Robes covered the sleeping places. Reeds and hides separated bodies from the cooler floor. Tools rested where they had been set down after the previous evening's work. Near the entrance, the air carried a faint edge of cold. Beneath the floor, a little food remained. Above the roof, snow covered the earth so evenly that the house seemed to have disappeared into the ground. Then someone woke. A hand reached toward the hearth and moved the ash aside. One coal brightened. Dry material touched its surface. For a moment, there was only a thin line of smoke. Then a small flame returned. It lit the nearest roof post, the edge of a robe, and a pair of worn moccasins waiting beside the bed. Outside, the first pale light crossed the snow. Inside, the fire no longer needed to prove anything. It only needed to last until morning.